Hi everybody, and welcome to Friday evening in the city and to the Open Book Festival. I know it's late in the day, you've probably done a couple of things already, but we are going to keep the energy levels high here this evening. And we've got a really interesting discussion planned for the next hour, which I hope you'll form a big part of. So just to introduce everyone here, my name is Firdose Moonda. I'm a sports journalist, which obviously has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. I'm also a yoga teacher and a yoga scholar, and I've got a deep interest in the politics of the body. And really that's, I think, where the heart of this discussion will lie. We've called it visibility and chronic conditions. I've got with me Nadine, Dirks, and Lesedi, Molefi. Unfortunately, our third participant, Nozibele, was not able to make it due to a family emergency. But those of you who have read her book and who maybe want to remark on it, we'll definitely have the opportunity to talk about that as well. And I guess these two works, I mean, they're over here, Hot Water and Patient 12A. They're not easy reads. They're really confronting, and they really ask a lot of the reader to do some inner work themselves while going through the work, which I think has really made it, for me, reading it, a painful journey, an agonizing journey at times, but also there's a light at the end of it, and I think you will experience something similar when you go through them. They're really, really necessary works. They're visceral, they're vulnerable, they bring out a lot that these two authors have to share, and thank you for being brave in writing these works, and for sharing a lot of really personal things with us, which I'm sure was difficult for you to go through. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here this evening and for talking to us about these issues. I've kind of divided the talk into 4 main topics of conversation, which I'd like us to have, and I'll ask you both some questions around that. And then, I mean, we're quite a small group this evening, so I'd love for you guys to get involved. If at any stage you want to say something burning in the middle of one of the questions, then please do, otherwise we'll leave some time at the end for that. So the first thing I would like to talk about is your feelings of being well or unwell, and I almost phrased it as your feelings of ease and dis-ease. And Lesedi, I want to start with you because through your book there's so many reflections on the inner child, on your childhood of moving around a lot, of craving stability in the instability, sure. Your journey through school. What was it like kind of going through that in terms of tracking your mental health via your childhood?
First of all, hi, everyone. Yeah, pretty happy to be here and having this chat. I guess I'm struggling maybe with your question for a bit. Maybe could you help me just understand what you mean?
Yeah, I guess, you go through each day that you are in treatment.
Yeah.
And then you kind of look back through incidents that happened in your childhood. And at one point, I think you even write or you say to the person that you're talking to, I've already lived this once.
Right.
Now I've got to live it all over again as
Sure.
part of my treatment. And your reflections seem to change, like you move from place to place, and
Yeah.
your mom took you out of school for 3 years. And it's kind of like, how did this shape the way your mental health journey progressed?
Sure. Interestingly, when I got there, I didn't even really understand how much I'd had to confront, which seems, I don't know, which doesn't actually make a lot of sense given that I'd already lived through so much. But for some reason, I just kind of thought I was okay. So I actually had no concept of, I guess, if you will, how miserable I was. I had no concept of, because I hadn't had any other life. That was essentially all I knew. And I think maybe it was only when I got a little bit older that I started, kind of seeing, I guess, how there were people around me who had more predictable sort of life milestones, and I didn't quite. And so it was, I think in writing the book the way that I did, I wanted the audience or the reader to sort of kind of also travel with me as I also misunderstand things, and also find clarity as I go along. And that's something I still continue to do. I give myself the permission to learn as I go. I give myself a lot of grace, I think, in that way. It's something I've had to do as a measure of survival, actually, So yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah,
the
I guess
question.
just to follow from that, because as you were talking, I just thought, did you look back at little Lesedi, the child, and say almost to that child, you know, you're going to go through these things, and when you look back at that child, think, oh my goodness, this poor little Lesedi, look at all that he went through.
So maybe it's worth starting at, you know, sort of like the very beginning of the process for me is that, you know, for me it was, or, you know, sort of my experience of depression was sort of the suppression of my experiences. And also the suppression of kind of how I felt about those traumatic experiences. So I was burnt out at work in 2016, and that's essentially when I decided, okay, maybe something's quite off, and quite importantly, I couldn't feel. And so that's kind of when I knew that maybe I should sort of like need to interrogate things a little bit closer. And so I think when you're suppressed to that extent, the job as an adult becomes to kind of excavate yourself in a way, you know, to kind of create a relationship with that inner child that's been suppressed, and to do it as an adult from a safe place, right? So you're essentially reliving, like somebody actually over there said something that we all laughed about, you know, is that, you know, therapy is basically paying to relive your worst life experiences, right? Like therapy is just basically paying to relive every one of your worst traumas, the most shocking things you've ever lived through, you know. And so, but importantly, you get to do it as an adult now, and you get to be quite patient with that traumatized child, and you get to sort of give that child what they needed. So, you know, it's not just reliving that trauma, it's also doing it with grace. Like I was saying earlier, it's also doing it with a lot of grace for what was suppressed, because it often feels like it's not, you know, it's not useful, it's not conducive, you know, it's disruptive, like rage, like anger, like pain, right? Like little boy living through so much trauma had every right to be angry, but I couldn't be angry at the time. So I suppressed it, and that's essentially what triggered my depression, was that I couldn't feel, because as a measure of survival, I had to squash those feelings away, because it wasn't conducive to my survival at the time to feel them. So as an adult, you know, it was about excavating those feelings, allowing those feelings to be processed healthily, and that's essentially the story of my book, you know. And I apologize to that kid, you know. Shouldn't have been the case. That shouldn't have happened. But also finding a lot of compassion for your parents is also quite important. And nobody warns you that eventually you have to kind of parent your own parents too. Right? So yeah, it's something I've learned since.
Many interesting points to pick up on there, but you used two words that I think speak so clearly to Nadine's work. The one was the excavating, and the other one is the idea of your suppressed pain. But Nadine, for you, the pain of having endometriosis was not at all suppressed. It was ever present. It was always there. And you were really just a child going through vaginal examinations that you write about. And then these terrible assumptions, you know, that you had an STI or multiple sexual partners. I mean, that must have been really horrific to go through as a child.
It was. I don't think there's any denying that. The part about kind of making sense of it, I suppose that's where the trauma lies, is that it's a difficult position to be in, because as someone dependent on the public healthcare system and in the community that I come from, there isn't much to be done. You don't say anything. You kind of, what is this? There's a documentary on Netflix, and I keep thinking of the title. You keep sweet and obey. That's what you do. You do all of that to survive. And so I think while this horrific thing is happening to you, the thing that you're left with feeling is completely helpless and powerless and disempowered in so many ways. But you also realize that if you don't behave in a certain way, that there's nothing that can be done. that no one is there to save you. And I think that's a scary reality to have as a child. It's scary seeing your parents be as disempowered as you are. And on this is looking at them on multi facets of who they are, but they are as helpless as you are, which I don't think is something a child should ever see. Your job as a parent is often to pretend to your child that you have everything together and you know what to do, and you are the superhero in the stories. But I think for lots of parents who are from similar backgrounds as mine, that option isn't there. It's stripped away from them, and it's not I want my child to go through hardships, or I want it to be that there's nothing that I can do, but they are disenfranchised. And so this idea of trauma is one that's very difficult, because of course I was going through it, I was there, I was experiencing it, but I don't think I realized how messed up it was until much later, where I am now having to think about these things, talk about these things, share and make sense of what I've gone through. And now it's kind of like, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. That's not the average experience. Even talking to other people with the condition that I have is realizing that other girls who didn't look like me, or had different financial outcome within their family, or just altogether different, is that they didn't experience those things. They weren't subjected to horrible physical examinations, vaginal examinations at 14 years old. That was not happening to them. And so I think, we'd like to imagine that those things are a thing of the past, and the stories of people like Henrietta Lacks is a thing of the past, and that this doesn't happen to black girls in the world, but it does.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was where I was going to go next, was that the next topic which I think we have to address is race. And I mean, you said people who don't look like me, and you also mentioned your parents being disenfranchised, and there's a particular reason for that, which is rooted in race. So this term misogynoir, and the misogyny towards women of color, we see so viscerally in your book. I mean, some of the doctors and the nurses are just inhumane in the way that they treat you. When did you realize there's an intersectionality to the way I'm being mistreated? It's not just I'm a woman, I'm a woman of a particular race, financial background, etc.
I think I realized this very, very early on when visiting the community healthcare centers. I started to examine a situation where I watched the way other people were treated, and I started to pick up that I was mistreated as is. But then I watched the way people who were unambiguous were treated. So people were darker than I was, people who had 4C hair. I watched this as a teenager, and I was like, oh, I didn't have a word for it. I didn't really talk about it, but it was very much something that I became aware of when I was, perplexed. I didn't understand why this was happening. And so it became this sort of thing that, okay, something's going on here, what do we do about this? Which is kind of how I started a career in activism, is seeing there's an issue and wondering what to do. And then I think when it became really apparent was when I was in hospital with, this was right before the diagnosis, I started to see how women were treated who did in fact have STDs, or were immigrants, refugees, and so forth, within the same healthcare system. I started to see that my treatment was better than theirs, and like you've said, mine was inhumane, so you can imagine what that looked like. And so it very quickly became a thing where I started to put things together, and I started reading and arming myself with knowledge, and that's when I started to say, okay, this is what this is. There's an intersectional issue here, whether that be of race, gender, class, in this case, even being a South African citizen. There were all of these barriers to entry, and how that then affected someone's quality of life or the outcomes. And that was terrifying.
I'm sure. I mean, I just want to ask you if you've got any kind of reasoning as to why there is this thought or expectation or assumption that black women in particular don't feel pain in the same ways. And then Lesedi, you might want to discuss that as well, because, in parts of your book you talk about black people who I've just actually written it down there, black people are poor communicators because we spent so much time being repressed and couldn't say anything about it. So I just want you to give me some idea of why you think people have that assumption.
To be honest, I sometimes I think that people have that assumption, and sometimes I think that they just don't care.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is equally as alarming. Is that there's just a general disregard and disdain for black bodies, and so it's this perception that even if you do experience pain, you are not as human as another group of people, and therefore it doesn't really matter. So you might have pain, but who cares, right? You're just another black body. It doesn't really matter what you have to say. And I experienced this even in public hospitals, right? Is that I would have way more extensive surgery. And I remember this very distinctly. There was this older woman who had her uterus removed. And so in terms of how the extent of our surgeries, mine was way more severe. I had been in ICU. This woman was about to go home after, 2 days or a day, something like that. I was being given Panado, 2 Panados, and this woman had a morphine pen, and she got to just hit it every time she felt that she was in pain. I was like, oh, that's crazy, because she could walk. I couldn't walk. I was bedridden, right? Couldn't do anything for myself. She could walk downstairs to go have a cigarette. Mind-blowing, right? But she had a morphine pen. And that's why I'm saying that just by virtue of who you are, you don't necessarily understand how different people are treated, because this is your experience. So in your mind, when you're being given that morphine pen, you think that that's everyone's experience. But it's not. And some of us are sitting there watching you and thinking, oh, that's incredible. Why is it that I'm not taken as seriously? Why is it that no one cares about whether I'm in pain? But it's because I can take it. She can't. I'm viewed as this thing that's able to carry a lot more than someone else can. And that's sad. It's sad. And I wish that, I wish for better for our country. I wish that we were better people. I wish that we all observe these things and question them, and that we had a more equal society. I really do.
I don't think you're the only one who wishes those things. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure.
And I mean, that's on the body, but then let's say on the mind, I mean, is there an assumption that, I don't know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of stigma attached to mental illness, but is there any kind of assumption around people of color not suffering as badly from mental illness, or, the things that you experienced talking to some of the people who were with you in treatment who were like, oh, it's not so bad, or get over it, or that kind of thing?
No, for sure. I completely agree with Nadine. I think there's just an implicit awareness, I guess, of the fact that the entire country was built on the back of black pain. From the start, from the jump, it relied on cheap black labor, and ultimately, the experience of pain on black bodies in order to kind of, literally build the country as we know it. And so, in a reality such as that, I think as a black person, what you do in order to survive is you become opposed to the feeling as opposed to the injustice. You ask yourself, why am I not stronger, I suppose? Which is something black men do a lot. We go, snap, like this, this sucks. And it does. But then you kind of go, okay, but then I guess I just have to suck less. Than the injustice, then suck less than the pain. I have to be stronger than it. And in order to do so, you must suppress your pain, in order to kind of cope with the reality and survive. I think a lot of us see that in our parents, fathers, mothers, who are just so suppressed, man, because, you know, like we often talk about, you know, black men don't do enough to feel, black men are cold, you know, black men are, you know, but man, like, survival requires it, you know, like you know, there's no time for compassion and self-inquiry. You know, there's no time to kind of sit there and really acknowledge the pain and live with it because, well, I'm going to starve to death and my family's going to starve to death. So I kind of have to keep it moving, you know. So in a reality like that, it almost does become true that, you know, we then ask of ourselves to feel less pain. And so we become complicit in our own suffering also. We're forced, actually, to become complicit in sort of our own suffering by repressing ourselves, depressing ourselves, and really disconnecting from our own bodies. And it's interesting you mentioned the body and the mind. I think that the mind and the body are intrinsically linked, of course. I mean, I can imagine, you know, what mentally that must have been like for you to go through what you went through. You know, it was not just a bodily experience alone, of course. You know, so... yeah, it's just the painful reality is that, you know, we have to go to those ends to survive, where we're just that repressed as a measure of survival.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's no time for compassion. There's no time for that kind of self-inquiry. You obviously took the time, found the time, made the time, however you want to phrase it. And I mean, I guess that speaks to issues which I wanted to talk about next of either it's a privilege of having that time, or it's the access to the public health facilities to give you that. So just what is your experience in general of either, I mean, A, creating the time, and then B, doing it in a public health facility? Is that the best solution for addressing these issues?
So I got really lucky. You know, like, my boss was great, you know, so in terms of kind of affording me that opportunity, I know it's something not many people have, right? I think maybe that also just kind of points to another point, like another theme around I think the importance of community, the importance of the people around you as you know, you work through your own survival. And I wouldn't have been in any position, I think, to find that time without, you know, the generous contributions of the company I worked for at the time. You know, I had just gotten medical aid at the time, for the first time in my life. Absolutely. You know, and that's also another reason why, for me, writing the book made sense, because I was like, oh, snap, guys, like, you know, there's all of these tools available that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to access that I wanted to make accessible, I think, through the book. You know, and that's why I wanted people to travel along with me, but also in a human way, right? Where it's like, you know, not just going to be like, self-talk is bad. Don't do that, you know what I mean? Yeah. It was more about just kind of, you know, the missteps and sort of the process of finding your feet, and, you know, and I wanted the reader to almost feel like they were at the clinic with me, because I understand how essential that care is, how important accessing that care is. It wasn't it was sort of like, sort of like a little private clinic situation in Parktown, Johannesburg. And I have seen my mom at Folateng at Johannesburg Hospital, and so the difference was clear as day, it was stark, right? The kind of quality healthcare people can access down the road. So I mentioned Parktown because just how close together, you know, Akeso and Johannesburg Hospital are, and yet it's an entirely different world of accessing care. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this, because I'm aware of that most people will never be able to access that, and I'm aware of how lucky I was to be able to access the time and the quality healthcare that I did in that particular moment. So I don't take that for granted at all.
And then, Nadine, yours was the opposite, right? Because you're in the public health system experiencing your own healthcare journey alongside other people also struggling to experience their healthcare journey. It did seem as though once you met Dr. Blau, for example, that things got a bit better. You met somebody with a little bit more kindness, who was a bit more gentle. So can you just talk about those differences? Like, how did public healthcare change?
It's stark. It really is stark. Oh, no, no. No. So it was just stark in terms of the public healthcare system and in private healthcare, seeing Dr. Blau. So just completely like polar opposites. Yeah, I was experiencing someone who wanted to know what I was thinking, wanted to know what I was feeling, who rallied behind me, who took on my workplace and was like, no, you don't have to deal with this. Hand me the phone. You know, someone who just really took out the time to be there. When I wasn't feeling well on a Sunday, it didn't matter to him. I could call and say, look, something's going on with me. Those are things that you're not afforded in the public healthcare system. I think a lot of what it comes down to and what's really important to note is that for me, the key things are choice. In private healthcare, when you're not happy with a service, you can just be like, I'm going to get a different opinion. You don't get to do that in public healthcare. In fact, doing that would result in a horrible outcome because, you think you're clever. You think that you can do what you want here. You know, you suddenly then get painted with a brush where you're problematic. So that's a very different overall experience. You also have time, and I think that's something that we take for granted. I had time to sit with my specialist and talk about things and talk about what I wanted and what I didn't want and what I thought was best and, you know, what his opinions were about certain things given the extent of my endometriosis. That was never something that public health facilities offered. And in that respect, I can't blame the doctors. They have, you know, hundreds of patients to get through. They just don't have the time to sit there and have that sort of chat with you. You know, they have 10 minutes to see you, get you in and out, and off you go for the next 3 months. So it's just a lot of what seems like small differences, but it can make a massive difference in the outcome of care at the end of the day. You get to decide in private hospitals that you want a less invasive option. Instead of being opened, you know, completely up, they decide, we'll do keyhole surgery because we can. You know, like getting that option for me was insane because my first surgery ever was literally being cut from hip to hip and living in staples and all sorts of things. And I was only 19. So, you know, the difference of being in a private facility where now we're having conversations and it's like the extent of my endometriosis, in fact, had gotten worse. But the kind of the outcomes and the things that you are dealt with is so less, it's so much less severe than if you were in a public healthcare system, which, I mean, if you did read my book and you know about all of the situations that happen even in private hospital, we had 3 surgeries after each other and I was in ICU for a very long time. I can guarantee that if that was the state hospital, I would have died. And it's simply because they do not have the interventions. When I was saying that, you know, I've had surgeries before, you get better, you don't get worse, I don't feel good. My doctor said, okay, let's have a CT scan and blood work. By the time I had sepsis, they had the results and they were like, let's go, we're operating, we have this sorted, we are intervening right now. That would not have happened in a public hospital because to get a CT scan is a major thing. You wait for a long time. And even in cases of emergency, it's probably not the first thing that they're going to look at. Maybe they'll look at blood work or whatever else and try to get you in. But by the time that they do that with something as time sensitive as sepsis, you will have died. And so I think my thing that I urge people to look at is look at the statistic of how many people have medical aid in this country, and then look at the fact that 77.9% of all people who have medical aid are white people, which means there's a small amount of people within that amount of people with medical aid who are people of color, and an even smaller percentage of black people with medical aid. So when we think of people who are dying early and dying of unnecessary things and so forth, majority of it would be black people, and that's just something that we can't escape, we can't not look at, we can't not examine as one of the major differences.
Yeah. And I mean, we didn't plan this in advance, but you've led very well into my final kind of discussion topic, which was going to be to ask you, given these contrasting experiences, both of you, Lesedi, your mom and yourself, and then for you, Nadine, what is your opinion of the NHI? And obviously that's a very contemporary topic, but I mean, I looked up a couple of kind of the fear factors around it, statements from medical aids, we won't name which ones, saying that everybody will have to pay a third more in taxes, VAT will have to increase to 21%, and then still saying that we're committed to providing good medical care for everybody. I mean, numbers aside, or we don't have to now be economists around it, but is this something that as South Africans, and especially as wealthy South Africans, not me necessarily, we have to consider as this is essential? We can't do without it, or are you suspicious of it?
Depends on the day. It depends on the day. Look, I think that probably as wealthy South Africans, which I'm sure none of us in this room are, I don't think wealthy people need to worry. As a wealthy person, you would never have to worry about your health care.
Oh, no, sorry. I mean, in terms of them having to pay more tax to support the NHI.
Yeah, well, I mean, too bad.
That's what I was looking for.
I think that, and I talk about this all the time. My sister, she's right here, but she'll always tell me, you talk about this country like you work for it. She says this to me all the time. When I talk about the government, I speak about us, we have to do. And I think that I said this to her just the other night. As active citizens, we have to talk like that. The problem here is that none of us see ourselves as custodians of this country. We don't see ourselves as owners of this country. And so we have this great divide between the government and us and all of those things. I think it's really important to be involved. It's really important to not just say, oh, there are these issues in this country and it's so frustrating, but what are you doing about it? So yes, like you said, all of us would want a better society, but how many people, even in this space, how many of us are actually doing something about it? How many of us are having these conversations?
There we go.
But I think for the majority of us, that's probably not something that's happening. And so we are often outraged, and we should be.
Sure.
But in that outrage, I don't think that we ever hold anyone accountable. We don't do the things that we need to do to be active citizens, and we should. Especially as a country that is very, very young. We are only 30-something years old. We like to look at other nations and be like, oh, why are we not as good as this country? And it's like, yeah, but they've had hundreds of years on us. And so I think that in terms of the healthcare system, it's a very difficult one. I think that it needs good governance. It needs people who are serious. It needs us to tackle corruption. It needs us to look at a host of things. If we can do that, then I think it's a good thing. If we can't, it will be another failure. Another failure wherein it sucks millions, if not billions, from taxpayers. And that's no good for anyone, wealthy people or not.
Sure.
And so I think the way we challenge that as people is that we ask questions. We go to these things and we listen to other people speak, and we make sure that we understand what's happening. And I think once we do that, then we can ask of the system to really shift where we want it to shift. So I think that, of course, we need a better system than we currently have. We need more resources, and we need more doctors who are paid, because, I mean, there are unemployed doctors, which is mind-blowing. But for me, the actual system, the system needs work. And so bringing in a different system doesn't take away the fact that the system needs work. And the system needs work everywhere in this country. It's not a Cape Town issue. It's not a Joburg issue. And so I'm not opposed to it, but I do think that we really need to keep an eye on it. We really need to make sure that we understand what's happening, and that we also are active in holding people accountable, because it can't be another way to suck the country dry. But I'm hopeful that with the new GNU, things seem to be a little bit different. I think that maybe this is something that we needed. I didn't think that it would work. It seems to be working. Maybe this is something we needed. We know that people aren't all friends, and so what happens when everyone's friends is that accountability doesn't happen. No one wants to tell their friend, look, you're messing up. That none of us will do that with our friends. And so maybe when we're not friends with each other, we find it easier to hold one another accountable. And so maybe under the new government, this will be something that we can look at and evaluate. But until then, I don't know exactly how to feel.
Sure, okay. I mean, I think you've been through quite a few of the kind of things we're thinking about with the NHI. And then, Lesedi, for you, I mean, how would you like to see it shape up, if at all?
Something that's interesting for me, I think, since publishing the book is how much people have used words like, and I'm sure you get it all the time, it's brave, right? It's the bravest thing ever.
Like we had a choice.
Yeah, first of all, exactly. I'm so glad you said that, because there's something about and of course it comes from the best place possible. It's not that I don't appreciate it, I really do, and I know it's an expression of love, but it's still like it's just such a plain reality that it's kind of weird to think of it as brave. In the sense that, it's kind of exceptionalizing perhaps the author, perhaps exceptionalizing me, when in reality, this is something that black men live with every day, black people live with every day, black women live with every day, people live with every day, people under a certain class threshold. And so, maybe we're also a little bit out of touch with our own reality. Like where it's like, wait, how are you surprised that so many people are struggling with their mental health? And when every single year when SADC starts to publish statistics on suicide daily, people are shocked. There's outrage, and it reminds me of when Cyril went on a train, I think a few years ago. Remember that? Like Cyril jumps on a train, he was like, I had no idea people are living like this. Like, what do you mean, right? Like, I mean, this is South Africa. We all are living here. It's a day-to-day reality. And so even our sense of urgency with something like the NHI, I think would be different if we were in touch with just how urgent the reality is on the ground, right? So, for me, I think writing Patient Toave, and I think there are many people who perhaps had my experience. First of all, I think there's at least one thing that half the country has experienced. That's in my book. I'm sure that's true for what's in Nadine's book as well, right? Where so many people sort of live with that, and so for me, I don't think there's a strong enough sense of urgency around these things, and maybe if we actually were a little bit more urgent about it, if we were a little bit louder about it, we'd realize just how much help we need. And because a lot of us just aren't even aware of how miserable we are, just how sick we are, just in how much pain we actually are. And so then when you ask me about the NHI, like even with with all the risks involved, I'm like, okay, let's weigh them out. Let's weigh out the risks. And I think inevitably the idea of accessing essential care for most people, given the urgency of the matter, seems to outweigh the risk of anything else, at least to me. And if the same sense of urgency is applied in sort of how we hold people accountable who are responsible for it, if the same urgency is applied throughout the process, then perhaps we'll get closer to achieving a style of it, or a model of it, or a mode of it that will, I think, be an accurate response to its necessity. It's necessary, I don't know how else to put it. So if it's necessary, you invent something to meet that necessity. I think that's just what we do.
I think that's a good word. There is a necessity for us to address the many sort of diseases that we're going through at the moment. So we've got... we have 20 minutes actually for some questions. I rushed you through that, sorry. Do we have any questions? We have got a mic going around, to speak to any of the issues that we discussed or any of the issues that have come up from the book or any of the issues around health, that may be in your mind. If not, we'll just keep them talking. But I'd prefer it if someone asked a question. We can we start there and then we'll come. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you both for your books and your stories. My name is Fefe. I think I can relate with both your experiences without making any reference to the books, but from a reproductive health perspective, I appreciate that you acknowledged, the difficulties that Black women go through first in getting their first period, struggling with your period for years, excruciating pain for years, and being undiagnosed because your mother, in Xhosa we call it isluma. And I think I want to also mention the struggles that a lot of Black girls go through of the myths around it and what can be done traditionally to sort of cure this problem. Or because your mother and your aunts have had this for years and that once you have a baby, it will be better.
Will go away.
Or that, something must be done for you traditionally to introduce you to the ancestors. It will be better, but nothing gets better. I also want to agree with you a lot on your experiences in the public health system. I think for a lot of women as well, when you go undiagnosed and something else happens, like you fall pregnant with reproductive issues, you're then, it's termed high-risk pregnancy. There are many, many issues that women go through from, one, being moved from your local maternal clinic to a further district hospital. You don't have money for transport, you can't speak the language, you never really have one doctor that is just directed to you. You basically see 4th year, 5th year, 6th year medical students, and you have to explain what's wrong with you throughout your problem. To getting infections while you're in hospital after surgery, like there's just so many horrific stories that I can tell, that many Black women can tell from that. And I don't think that from a narrative perspective it's been done. So I appreciate your book a lot, because a lot of maybe like medical papers have been written, but they don't get to the people who need them. We don't have enough education about reproductive issues, from fibroids to endometriosis to menopause for that matter. As I said, because if your mother's had this and you have it, it's so normalized. So I think there's so much space, and I wish that this conversation would trickle down to, the LO classes. That LO can, and biology can be really, unpacking issues that girls go through because no one knows. I also want to lay to your experience, mental health. And it's probably not a question, but a comment around growing up in a township. You also normalize a lot of things. You don't think it's abnormal to grow up experiencing violence, witnessing violence, and you don't actually think that that does anything to your mental health. Sure. Only when you grow up, you go to university, you start understanding that nothing was normal. And so there's a lot of, again, going back to like being Black and coming from traditional families. If you've got mental health issues, it will be misdiagnosed as the calling in often. some cases, and if you go to a
Baoloile.
church space, if you go to a church, it will be like you've got demons, your mother will have prayer circles for you. There's just so many things that we are misinterpreting because there's no language for it. I mean, how do we even explain that you are depressed to your grandmother? I mean, what do you mean? So I appreciate these stories, and I also want to say that it's so important that these stories get to the people who need them, even if it means translating the books to different language, even if it means, getting them in schools. But it's such important topics that we actually need to talk about them even more. So thank you.
Thank you so
Can I
much for
ask
that.
the two of you to just respond to that? Yeah, just in terms of who you wrote this for and where it's reaching.
That's wow. Thank you for that. Thank you for that comment, man. And you also mentioned the language that we use, right? And I love that you said that so much. I was talking to a friend recently, and we were talking about even just like some of the concepts within sort of like psychiatry and sort of the psychology itself, right? And whether or not they're actually modeled around life here. You know what I mean? So it's like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. There's nothing post about it for me, man. Or for you, right? Like there's nothing post about it for us. It's like, it's pre-traumatic because tomorrow, statistically, I'm likely to experience another extreme horror. I'm struggling with this microphone. I wonder, if even the language that we use and even how we understand it is formulated specifically for the realities here, which is what I love so much about what you said about even just sort of the language. And completely agreed. I would hope that these stories reach reach people, in places where they need to be affirmed the most. They need to hear that they're not imagining it. And that's something we get a lot of. You're imagining it, or and so I'd agree. And perhaps when we have sort of that groundswell of conversation and sort of energy that builds like literally from that place upwards, then maybe it can go as far as even changing our idea of some of those the disciplines themselves, and how we teach them and how we understand them.
Thank you so much for that. It's incredible because as you're speaking, right, you're saying, you're talking about your own experiences, but it's as if you're talking about my book, because literally from start to finish, that's the case. And I agree with you, you get told, we are gula. What's happening exactly then? But it's never really been explained. It's something that, and this was my experience. Like you speak about your mom and your aunts, exactly that. For me, it was my mom has always had this problem. Her sisters have always had this problem. When you have a child, it will get better. But what is the problem? No one knows. No one can explain it. And if we can't explain it, we can't seek help for these problems, right? And that was a barrier to my own healthcare. And like you say about having to travel, it costs money. So I have to go from one township to the other township to get help. And it takes the entire day. So I'm missing school. And it's a horrific thing because I was 14, like I said, and it was for the longest time, it was said that I had a chronic back condition. What 14-year-old has a chronic back condition? I haven't been mixing cement for 40 years, and I've been put on narcotics. And so the idea was essentially just to have this person on painkillers because we don't know what's going on, but we don't investigate either. When I ended up in hospital, when they finally diagnosed what I had, after accusing me of botched abortions and being told that's what you people do, STDs, all sorts of funny things as a child. And then I'd have a panic attack, and this person would laugh at me maniacally and say, I'm going to find out anyway. This is what you people do. This man didn't imagine, and like you said, I'm saying this man, but in actual fact, it was many men and then women as well. And I never saw someone who identified with me or my experience that made sense to me. It was white men or white women, or I suppose most diverse would have been an Indian woman, but my experiences weren't better there either. But no one ever checked for endometriosis, and they tell me that the reason why we don't look for it is because that is a European illness. So by the time I was diagnosed with this thing, it was at stage 4. It was deep infiltrating. It was affecting organs. It had affected my health to the point that it will never return. I have issues with nerve pain down my leg. It has rendered me disabled because no one cared to look for it. And they don't care to look for it because, whatever, your life doesn't matter. Another one of you, if you die, who's hurt, right? It's just another one of you, there'll be more. That's the perception. And so I agree with you that this is something that's really important to me, and this is why I wrote the book. When I was asked, who's your target audience, and the marketing person put women, I was like, no, women are not my target audience. They are very particular women who I'm talking to. And it's not that I don't care about anyone else, so I don't want them to buy the book, but the other people are not going to die. They are not going to be left without care. They are not going to be rendered disabled because no one wanted to give them contraception because they were too young, even though my mom agreed to give me the medication to help me. So for me, it is about saving the lives of Black women first. That's my priority. That is where I am always situated and always going to find myself, because there's no one out there that looks out for us. And so, like I said, I want everyone to read the book because everyone can benefit from the book. This is not to say that it doesn't take long for endometriosis to be diagnosed in white women. It does, but there's recourse. You see the same doctor for a period of time. If you're unhappy with that doctor, you seek care elsewhere, or you ask for, I want a referral letter to go see whatever specialist you want to see. That's not an opportunity that's given to Black women. And so I really appreciate your input, and it is so important. You are not speaking to people who are not hearing you, and I want you to know that what you have shared matters, and it changes the way that we engage with the world after this. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys for those responses.
Hello, Lesedi, I wanted to say thank you. Your story really resonated with me. In 2018, my body caught up with my mind. And I booked myself into a clinic, and honestly, it was the best thing I've ever done. The hardest thing I've ever done, I will never refer to it as brave, it was something that needed to be done. Yeah. Something that you mentioned as well, you said the physical and the mental coincide. And I was thinking about, we grew up in a very volatile community where basically the motto is to kap aan, so keep going no matter what. And you are constantly in survival mode. And, even when you're making it, you can't kind of enjoy that moment because your body is catching up with your mind. So for me, I would like to know from you, or, whether it's a comment or not, do you think that as a younger generation, we have kind of worked on the taboo that comes with mental health? And I think that obviously there's a degree that's quite different, especially with men, having to open up and be vulnerable, when I think that our society is incredibly, hard on men when it comes to, there's no breaking down. If you break down, we break down with a beer. That's acceptable. And that's incredibly, horrible to yourself and to your mind, and it's never gonna, end up in a good situation. But so do you think that the newer generation, the younger generation, are better at destigmatizing mental health? And for you, do you think it's quite important to have a therapist that you can relate to? Because that's something that I really struggled with. I want to continue my mental health journey, but to sit opposite someone and tell me, oh, just put your foot down with your mother, that's not a thing. Someone that can relate to you from a cultural perspective as well, I think is quite important. So I wanted to know if you've experienced that as well.
Oof. Wow. Yeah, first of all, I could literally feel you while you're asking that question, right? I could feel how important it was to you, and I could feel it because I felt the same way, especially around Kapan. Just kind of keep on keeping on, keep surviving. I think I got lucky with my therapist. Unfortunately, not seeing them at this very moment, but yes, I have the similar struggle where I've tried to find a therapist I could really go there with, like go to some really, really painful places with. And what's interesting to me also is, I think while we were at the clinic, and I don't know if that was your experience as well, for a lot of us there, so I mean, in the book, I tell the story about the courtyard. There was this little courtyard, right? You know what I'm talking about? We're sitting there all day, chain smoking, talking all kinds of nonsense, but that's actually where so much of the healing happens, right? Because you're not actually talking to a therapist, talking to people who've had the same experience as you, and who are doing what you were talking about earlier, which is, kind of giving you that sense of, how you feel is true, just kind of affirming you and affirming your spirit. And I think maybe sometimes, there is that kind of fixing, sort of quick fix approach that some people feel their therapists do that might alienate them, as opposed to affirm them first, right? And there's so much that needs affirmation, I think, in this country. There's so much gaslighting, that happens all the time. You know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, look at Palestine, right? There's so much suffering that's plain to see. It's plain, it's obvious. And yet there's so much gaslighting about it. And so, even with your own experiences, if you're not at first affirmed and told that actually, yes, man, it really do be like that. Actually, your mom did hurt you. Your dad really did hurt you. Something my therapist said at the time was that, I think a lot of the time people think forgiveness is forgetting that it happened. But if you do that, then what is there to forgive, right? A crucial part of forgiveness is the full acknowledgement of what there is to forgive. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And so a full acknowledgement of the experiences that you've had and how much they've hurt you and how much they've destroyed you is something I think is a step we often skip, because we're trying to get to, I want to heal, I want to be okay, kapan, like you were saying. So I'd agree with you, man. I think a lot of people struggle with finding the right therapist who's graceful enough and patient enough to do that. And I wish, there were more sites of community as well. Sites for community like this, in fact, like the conversation you and I are literally having right now, right? It's where people can really just talk to each other, and I think that goes a long way toward beating the stigma that you were talking about earlier, beating the shame that's associated with it. It's just kind of the realization that, oh yeah, it's actually all of us. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like we're actually all kind of going, we're all living in this capitalist hellscape, right? And that's just the reality, and oftentimes we just need each other there to affirm each other. And thank you so much for what you said, I think, about black men, and even more broadly men, but I think black men especially, right? Especially given the class sort of dynamics involved there, black men are punished, absolutely punished for expressing any sort of weakness and vulnerability. and also, black men's kind of emotional, because of just how emotionally repressed and suppressed so many black men are. A lot of black men lack the emotional education to even be able to defend themselves when they're being emotionally violated. They don't know that it's happening. They don't know it's taking place. They just kind of feel like, oh yeah, I'm a man. So, at the end of the day, this is just kind of what happens to me, and I need to keep it moving. I need to keep going. But yeah, it is a lot of punishment. But for me, that was one of the reasons why I thought it's important to write it. Is just kind of be like, hey man, hey, this is who I am. Hi. And weird story. I've told this a couple of times, right? So about the Uber driver. They know the story. So I was at the clinic, and so when you admit yourself to the clinic, you get to travel in and out as maybe not as you please, but quite a lot. So I think I was going back to my place in town from the clinic, and on my way back I took an Uber, and I was talking to the Uber driver, and he was sort of like, where are you going? And I was like, I'm going to a Kiso clinic, and I was like, what's going on there? And I was like, it's a mental health clinic, for people with depression and anxiety. I was like, depression and anxiety, what does that mean? So I kind of start, trying to explain what kind of goes on in there, and he's puzzled. He's totally puzzled, looking at me in the rearview mirror, and he turns around at some point and he goes, "But I don't understand. You look like you get girls, And this is another thing, right? It's like, that's obviously a joke. It's funny, but for so many of us, it's like, I have a car. Why am I depressed?
Yeah.
I have a job. Why am I depressed? I have a house. Why am I depressed? We use these sort of arbitrary, silly measures, really, to kind of, and this is something we do to ourselves a lot as well, where we kind of go, well, I've got a job. I have no right. Like, my fridge is healthy enough, why am I unhealthy? And I wish we'd stop doing that, to each other and to ourselves.
Thank you, Lesedi. Thank you, Nadine. We are out of time, and I think our volunteers want us to leave soon. Did anybody else have a really burning question that must be answered this evening? If you did, the authors will be signing books, and you can buy them downstairs, and I'm sure you can run into them for the rest of this weekend as well. So thank you, both of you, Lesedi and Nadine. Thank you for sharing this hour with us, and thank you to everybody for coming. I hope that we took some communal healing, or at least some provocation out of this conversation, and see you around the festival. Enjoy Friday night.